The technique I'm going to be showing you now is a rather interesting approach to creating terrains. Essentially, we're going to be using the geometry from procedural terrain altitude to control and generate terrain information that would end up being a standard terrain, or kind of the base shape for the terrain itself, which then procedurals can be run on top of. So I'm going to start by adding in procedural terrain to the scene, and we're going to go ahead and edit the object. And I'm going to start by turning off the zero edge mode for the procedural. I also want to note that in case you need to go back to a previous version of Vue, or you haven't upgraded to 8 yet, these effects in this process will run in Vue 7. At least for the most part. There are a couple of limitations. Of course, any sculpting that we end up doing is going to be limited to Vue 8 and future versions. And also a technique using the zero edge mode will not be available directly within the 7.0, 7.5 versions. We're going to switch over to the procedural tab and go ahead and edit the altitude reduction. So we can right click and edit the function, or we can control and click on that in order to open function editor. I'm going to start by removing the seed that's generated, which is just kind of a random vector. What I want to do is start with the Perlin noise value. I'm going to click edit and switch to ridged mode, which normally doesn't work too well. We do have to make sure we click OK. But it normally doesn't work too well for a procedural just because the sharp edges it will create. And it does look like there might be a little bit of an error here, not allowing me to keep that ridged mode. So after I turn that on, I'm just going to click OK to close the function editor. And this time I'm going to click right-click edit function rather than control clicking, because I have noticed in the current version, at least in Windows 64-bit, that control click does tend to cause some problems, as we can still see happening. So it has reset itself once again, and it's because the control key is still being technically held down, which is part of the error. Go ahead, click OK, and go back and edit the object, and we should be able to successfully get this to work. And it looks like I will need to probably just close the application. So definitely stay away from control clicking to edit functions in the terrain editor for sure. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of close this out and get back into the terrain. And this time, now that I have a new setup, I'm going to go ahead and just reset the function completely, edit it, and add in, just starting with simple fractal, switching this over to the Perlin noise value, edit, select ridged, click OK, and we're going to connect that altitude to the altitude output of the simple fractal. And now we can see that is working correctly. The origin at 0, 0, 0 for the Perlin noise value tends not to look very good. So I'm just going to move around the Z origin, and I'll just go ahead and type in a value. Go ahead and do 45 on the Z, and 25 on the Y, and negative 10 on the X. I'm also going to take the largest feature amount and just go ahead and move that, change it to 6. Now, you can tell it's very, I guess, computer fractal looking. I'm going to click the only when saturating and then click it again to try to get the terrain to fit in a little better. Turn on the auto fit. so you can see what this looks like a little better. We can probably go ahead and just increase this. But to kind of get away from this grid look that is showing up, what we can do is use the with rotation. Now, that default value with rotation, it will rotate around the fractal to produce a different type of look for the terrain and generate it a little differently. I'm going to use a custom rotation rather than the built-in with rotation. So this would basically be the exact same thing, except we can define our own value. So I'm going to right click and add in a math node, vector operations, and select rotation and twist. And I'm going to go ahead and just connect the simple fractal to the rotation and twist, and then that back up to the position. Go to edit, and I'm going to set on the X 45 degrees and on the Z negative 45. And then we can go ahead and close that out. And this is going to give us a much better looking terrain. And if it wasn't for the fact that the ridged fractal has such sharp edges, this is a very efficient way to create an eroded terrain because these rotation values mimic very well the actual erosion process, where we have a value being our Perlin noise value, which is more of a square type fractal. Now, typically you would think the erosion is more of a hexagon shape, but if you rotate a cube 45 degrees, and then like we have the 315 on the Z, typing negative 45 will just bring us to a positive value. So 45 and 35, if you were actually take a cube and rotate it like that, look down on it, it's going to have an outline of a hexagon, even though it's just a cube rotated on its side. This in turn creates a very nice looking mountain, but once again, the limits of the value creates a huge ridge. When we have the ridge mode on, it's really the only way to get that nice look, but we'll just go ahead and take a look at the render so you can see exactly how this would turn out if we were to keep it the way it is. And I might need to change our scale a little, but I'll just switch this over to the final mode, and we'll just take a look at a quick render. Now, at the moment, it actually looks pretty good. The only problem is the roughness. The roughness looks terrible. It's not a desirable look. It's very boxy still, and depending on the overall elevation you end up with, you're really going to need to remove the roughness value. So I'll render it again, and then we're going to reduce the roughness and really take a look at the shape that's generating this overall terrain. So for the most part, this is really just too rough. So we need to reduce the overall roughness. Once we do that, we're going to start to see those fine lines showing up. So if I reduce it to 0.4 for the roughness, and I do want to note that in version 8, at the moment, you do have to click OK instead of being able to push Enter, as in previous versions. And now the smaller the fractal would be, if we're working with something that's probably a little bit too big, we'll still be able to see what's going to happen with the edges. And it's not exactly something that looks good. Mixing this with other fractals to try to fill in the noise doesn't work all that well. It is rather difficult to get rid of those very fine lines without using the roughness. So I just wanted to show you that. But it does become a very good fractal for the method I'm going to be showing right now. So what I'm going to do is reduce the largest feature. Let's go ahead and set it to 3. And take the roughness and bring it back up 0.5. We can also increase the gain to really get some good subtraction in there. And in the output observer, it really looks good. It looks like a nice terrain. Unfortunately, it just doesn't render the way it looks in here. So I'm going to set the gain to 3. Click OK. And one thing you'll be able to see in this case is that it's really stretched out. So if we do need to reduce the Z scale, which I'm just doing with the gizmo, and if we take a look, we'll just look at the render before we begin basically destroying the procedural end of this terrain. But you can see the way the terrain steps down when using this rotation with more of a square type noise. It can be rather convincing. The only thing is of course, that roughness value. I'm going to go ahead and just load in a different atmosphere and adjust the sun a little to kind of match where it was before slightly. And I believe this atmosphere is using shadow maps. And if you weren't aware, anytime you save an atmosphere, the sunlight settings are saved with it. So if you're using shadow maps, that will save with the atmosphere. And those are not independent. Okay, so let's go ahead and start the process. I'm going to go back into Terrain Editor, and my current resolution that we can see at the top is 512 by 512. At the moment, this is really just being used to kind of preview the terrain in the editor, not really having an impact. That pixel layer in geometry is just completely flat. I'm going to switch over to the Effects tab, and what I'm going to start doing is modifying that pixel layer, which I guess would be layer 1. If we were to break down the layers, as covered in other parts of the training, we're talking about how to reset certain points of data, this layer would end up being, I guess, layer 1. The procedural and the altitude production I'll refer to as layer 2, and then sculpting and the displacement layer would be layer 3 in the different levels. So we're adjusting what would be layer 1. And what I want to do, I'm just going to take the rock hardness and move it about center and run the river valley erosion. Now, the higher the pixel resolution is, the longer this is going to take to run. The complexity of the fractal doesn't manipulate the overall time it takes to process the effect. It's just how many times the effect needs to run continuously over the current geometry in order to create the look that we're seeing right now. It effectively creates probably one of the best erosions. The only problem is, at least right now, we wouldn't be able to render this and get anything acceptable unless we converted it to a standard terrain first. So just to show you what this is going to look like, we can see a little bit of procedural along with this modified value. So just by itself, it doesn't look good. The geometry manipulates the way the fractal and the procedural can run, and in fact doesn't create anything worth looking at. If you were to remove the procedural, it would look better. So now we're going to continue the process. The more we run these effects and manipulate the procedural and the altitude production, the more detail we can pull out of this and actually end up with a usable terrain. So now we can start to run dissolve over the top of it. We can use the alluvium, apply glaciation, and I'll go ahead and use the fluvial very loosely. Don't want to use too much of that just because it is a rather harsh subtraction. Usually you'd want to use with a higher hardness value, although you typically would want to use alluvium afterwards to fill that in. Continue to run dissolve, and we can really start pulling out a pretty decent terrain. So if you were to, even just at this point, convert this over to a standard terrain, you would get something that looked pretty good. Keeping in mind that the procedural is still extruding what would be the flat layer. So we can go between different pixel values. We can go ahead and increase the resolution to 1024 by 1024, and now we can start to see those really terrible noise and roughness effects caused by the procedural. And we can start to run the dissolve filter, and we will reach a point where we're not seeing much impact from these effects, and there's a couple of different ways to deal with that. We'll look at that in just a little bit as we continue to move through this process. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and with this extra bit added, we can see the noise becomes more reduced, much smaller of a grain, although we would effectively just be removing the procedural altogether. So we can see something that looks pretty interesting. We've got a nice eroded effect. So let's continue. And it's also a good idea to start saving out the scene. And most of these scene files with just the terrain by itself is a really small file. Doesn't take up a lot of space, so you may want to save in your different steps along the way in case you want to come back, because there are ways to blend some of the previous versions together with current versions. So I'll just go ahead and save this really quick, and then we can continue. And we'll go back into the terrain. And what I'm going to do is go over to the procedural and take the scale and bring it down halfway to 0.5. Typically, you need to have the scale. If you use a value in between, it tends to have strange results. If I go ahead and type in 0.8, we can see that the data that it's really being extruded is a little too choppy. Doubling the scale may also produce the same sort of an effect. And that's more something that you're going to run into in View 7. View 8 tends to behave a little bit better. Of course, once we bring it down this low of a resolution, or this low of a scale, we can really see a very jagged terrain. But we can use this different scale to now define some of these other effects, and in turn kind of pull out some more data. So let's go ahead and bring this up to a scale of 2. Use the dissolve, go back to the procedural, and now I'm going to type in a value of 0.5. And then we can continue to run additional effects. So the process kind of continues this way. You can change the fractal around the altitude reduction as many times as you want, increasing, decreasing the resolution to create different effects and variations within the terrain, completely controlled by Procedural. And it's a much easier way than just using the add function up at the top when you have a standard terrain, which allows you to just run a fractal over the top of the terrain to produce elevation. This is a much different way of producing this kind of elevation data, and it is easier, and I think you have a lot more control with it when you use this method. It also allows you to kind of step down in different scales to really generate the most interesting terrain you can get. And just run that once or twice, and bring the procedural back to the scale of 1, which is where we started. Also keeping in mind that if we remove the procedural, the terrain is going to look very different. Because in fact, these layers are working independently, and really we're just using layer 2, the procedural altitude, to modify layer 1 and kind of extrude from there. In a way, it works kind of like the displacement does with sculpted geometry, except that it only extrudes on the z-axis or the up-axis, rather than being able to move on all axes. And now I'm just using the erosion effects. You can of course use any of the tools to modify that layer. Going to the pane effects, I would suggest staying away from the 3D tools at the moment, just until you get a reasonably working two-dimensional terrain before you go and start making it 3D. Although, don't feel restricted by that. You obviously can produce some very nice effects. It's just the detail can be difficult to see once the 3D sculpt is enabled in that displacement layer. So you can also sharpen and use the global effects that are available on the bottom in order to produce a really neat look overall. So let's take a look at what we currently have that will be rendering, and it's definitely starting to look better. Keeping in mind too that little grit that we're seeing won't be there once the terrain is complete, and we either convert it to a standard terrain or modify the fractals as part of the altitude production to find something that would work better. So let's go back into the terrain. Now, you can modify the procedural however you want and continually change it. Sometimes it is, however, good to stick with the same procedural, and then one cool thing you can do is just kind of move the origin of the Z down and create sort of a recursive effect on the erosion by slowly stepping it down, or even in this case changing the scale. But now I want to show you some other advantages to this method. First, I just want to show you what it is the terrain looks like at the moment. So I'm going to just delete the link between the altitude and the fractal, so that all we're going to see is the modified layer. So this is the geometry we've created by using the procedural. And by itself, it's probably not going to be amazing until further modifications are made. Just because right now it's very much the same throughout. Not very unique. So let's take a look at one of the other operations. What we're going to do is select 0 edges and turn that on. Now that we have this enabled and no altitude, being created from a procedural. We're essentially curving the terrain down, and it also changes the direction in which the effects are going to be applied. Also, any sort of painting, whether we inflate or change the freeform, and it's going to curve the terrain. Now, the entire bottom is cut out because the elevation of this data is not high enough in order to show up on the bottom. And I do have my color map modified with red on top and bottom to show me exactly where the warning zones are, where I'm about to lose information. So what I can do is go back just for now, and it looks like my altitude is gone. So if you need to, you may need to kind of save that out because it looks like at the moment, unless your function is connected to the altitude, it will be deleted. But now that we're back here after opening that and nothing else is in there anymore, we now see that that area that was deleted or not showing is now showing up. Either way, it's beneficial. I do kind of like when it is clipped out. There are ways to do that. But first, let's just take a look the way it is right now, running some additional effects. And what it's going to do is start running from the edges, and it's going to be a lot more intense around the sides. And it may be showing up with a much more dramatic effect once there's a procedural running. But we can really smooth this out and change the angle in which everything is being blended together. And now what I'm doing is running the glaciation filter, and because the zero edges is on, it's going to go from the outer edge and subtract it pretty drastically. Without zero edges on, it's going to be pretty equal throughout the terrain and not really give us that type of subtraction. So now if we turn zero edges off, we can take a look at the geometry we've created, where before it was very even, but now we have a lot more variation. And then in turn, the effect will act differently. Now at this point, I do want to note that these erosion effects do require the terrain to be at a certain height, and basically very low within the color map. And in this case, I would really need to see some of that red showing up in order for the effects to properly work. Once we have that procedural back, or we add another one, we'll be able to more effectively start to subtract other areas. But this process of going back and forth with the zero edges can be really useful. You also had the possibility to use the clipping in order to define areas a little better. So what I'm going to do is clip out the lower portion of the terrain, and now we can start to run the effects again. I'm going to go ahead and soften this, and if they're not really showing up, I may need to reduce the overall elevation. So I'm going to go back and just turn on the zero edges and start to clip this up a little and see if we can just get a little bit of an impact that way. And it looks like it may not really work all that well because of the way the force extension works. But we can see that little ridge being created that was just created. Go back, turn off zero edges, go to the procedural, edit the function, and I'm going to add in another fractal for us to work with. So I'm going to choose add in a fractal. I'm going to change this over to the terrain fractal. And I've got some settings I like to use for this. I'm going to turn off the with rotation and go ahead and connect the altitude to the altitude output so we can start to see it. What I want to do is remove the metascale completely. I really prefer the look of the terrain fractal without metascale on. Anytime the metascale is smaller or a lower number than the largest feature, it is in fact off. Metascale is more useful for extremely vast areas, things like planetary terrains, and along those lines. If you want good close-up detail or fine terrain detail, a lot of variation, then you want to get rid of the metascale because it doesn't give you the kind of look that you can achieve without it on. So what I'm also going to do is take the smooth area altitude and turn it down just about all the way. Move down to the bottom of the noise and change it to billows, which I prefer a little bit more, although it really depends on some of the other settings. We'll take a look at that in a sec. I'm going to take the roughness value and set it to 0.59, because sometimes the roughness is a little too high. If you're going to be animating the terrain fractal, don't use the default for sure, because it's way too high to begin with, and the fine noises that are created are horrible for flickering. I'm going to take the largest feature, move that down a little. I also want to note that the gain for the terrain fractal is a lot different than the gain for other fractals. Normally, reducing the gain all the way down to just about 0 will remove almost all elevation from the fractal. The terrain fractal is a combination of several fractals together blending, and the gain itself increases or decreases the impact of the blend of those separate fractals. So you can actually go between what looks like ridges now by reducing the gain up to more of a billowy look once you get above 1. It's also connected to the way the smooth areas work. Another thing I want to do is take the bump surge, which also has an impact based on the gain, and then reduce the distortion, because normally the default distortion I think is a little too high and unrealistic. If you increase it to a really high amount, you can see what happens, but the problem is the subtraction it's creating and the distortion that's caused really is unrealistic, whether it's a large amount or a really small amount. But we do need to have just a little bit of it in there in order to prevent any tearing that could potentially happen between the blends of the different terrains, or the different fractals that are internally part of the terrain fractal. So we're going to start with that, and if you do need to reduce that output, rather than using gain, you could just take a filter, and it probably would be best to do this directly within the function editor and not within the terrain editor where there's the other filter just underneath the altitude production, because that does have a tendency to reset. So if you needed to reduce the output, the easiest thing to do is take a look at the function node preview and look at the extension. If the extension number, and this is very small on my screen, but you'll be able to see it pretty clearly. The extension amount, if we have automatic extension on, anytime we go beyond a value of 1 or -1, it will set the extension to that max value. So if we ended up with a terrain or any fractal output that was higher than 1, that extension will change. If it was like 32 or even -38, it'll say 38 or 32. May not say negative or show the positive, but it'll be helpful to let you know what your furthest point is. So what you can do is use the map filter, select the connection between altitude terrain fractal, and this allows you to limit or increase outputs. So our lower value is -1, upper +1. Lower value by default sets to 0 for the output range. I'm going to bring that down to -1 because that is what we want. But if we didn't want to reduce this, we could easily just bring down the upper value, bring in the lower value, and I wouldn't suggest clipping the out of range values because it will cut off the terrain, and it could create a very large unwanted flat area. So what I'm going to do is just start bringing them in just a little. If you start to see a subtraction within the output observer, you can ignore it. Clicking on only when saturating, turning it off will fix the preview. And then we can go back and click OK. And then we'll be able to see the fractal with this geometry and whether or not we want to add any extra detail with it. So let's go ahead and take a look at a render with this set. And I don't really have any materials on this at the moment except just the default, so it's a little bit easier to really take a look at the geometry and the terrain itself. We can tell that overall that fractal is probably too small because the terrain is a little too high. But we'll just take a look at what we have at the moment. And you can see the fractal mixing with that generated part of the terrain. It is unfortunate that we lost that information from the original noise, which is why it's a good idea to save between every step or every large change, because that in fact was creating probably the best look for this type of an erosion. So if it's something you want to stick with, in my case I would fall back to a previous version if I would have saved. Otherwise, just do it over again. But depending on the output that is mixing with the standard terrain level 1 geometry, you may not see much of the fractal because the output may need to be adjusted. So you can use that map filter to limit the output amount to only work within certain values. So let's go ahead and set that map to 0 for the low value and 1 for the high. And we're going to see how that works out. The terrain fractal can be a little touchy with its output values, whether it subtracts or adds to the terrain. We can increase the scale. Let's bring it up to 2. And it looks like we may need to work with the lower value instead. So what I can do is just modify the output range to -1 to a value of 0. And hopefully we'll be able to just kind of subtract from there. If not, we can increase the overall amount. You don't have to stick within -1 and 1. You can go beyond it if that's what you need to do. So we do have this lower range, and if I was to extrude it, probably look a little better. I'm going to go ahead and just take the upper value and set it to 4, and the lower value and set it to -4, which is going to give us a much larger output. I'm going to go back into the terrain fractal and increase the largest feature. Actually, I may need to decrease it, and I do want something a little bumpier. It looks like the roughness is still a little too high. I'm going to set it to 0.55. What I can also do is go to the smooth area under noise variation and reduce it from 3. The lower you go, the more smooth zones there will be, and the more smoothing overall within the terrain. So if you have a lot of really rough, jagged areas you want to get rid of, you can reduce the smooth area. Also, modifying the smooth area altitude will have a huge impact on the output, especially when we're affecting and doing the technique we're doing right now. So definitely by having that very large output, increasing it to 4, we're able to impact the terrain much more because we already have that geometry there. So we need a much more powerful fractal in order to be able to subtract or add to it. But in turn, it does end up working pretty well. So now we have the combination of both the fractal geometry and that eroded geometry that was generated. And we should have something that looks a little bit better. So now we can continue the process and go a bit further and also start sculpting and limiting some of these areas if needed. I am going to modify my shadow maps really quick. I'm going to switch it over from soft shadow map to ray trace. Change the softness value to, actually let's use 2 degrees, and then when we open back up the light editor, which I just did by double clicking, or you can right click, edit object, we now have a dispersion amount. So we can set the dispersion, go ahead and set it up to, let's say 2, which will reduce the overall softness amount. And I have my sampling boost set to 2, I'm going to bring it to 1. Typically you'd want a higher value for 3D terrains, or the displaced terrains. And actually that dispersion amount might be set incorrectly. And it does in fact need a lower amount. So I'm going to set the dispersion to 0.05, just enough to get a small amount of smoothing around the edges, but not a very harsh shadow and not a very dispersed shadow. Also can modify the softness, bring it down to 1 degree to fix that a little bit more and pull out some of the details. Procedural terrains tend to work better with ray tracing in the overall look. Standard terrains tend to look better with shadow maps, in the softer shadow maps. So I am going to continue this process and show you some other techniques along with it. One thing you can do that's pretty neat is if we use the force extension, we can modify the terrain outside of the defined value. So I'm going to force the extension, or actually reduce it, to 0.1. So now we just have this very limited region. Might need to get a little more data from it so we can increase that amount. And this extension amount is normally auto-generated if force extension is checked off. And you'll even see grayed out the number that it's producing in order to reach a filled-in terrain. But we can in fact use this cutoff since we are within the red zone and those areas in order to erode a very specific part or kind of a clipped range by using the erosion effects, which normally is kind of a global control. So this way we can actually clip out top and bottom by adjusting that force extension amount, reducing it to clip out the terrain. And in turn we can end up just really creating some very interesting effects. I'm going to go ahead and turn up the resolution. It might take a little bit longer to generate, but we'll be able to get much finer details. Also increasing the rock hardness will provide the same result. And if you do want to use these effects with the material distribution, you just need to make sure that you have a mixed material set up, or it will set one up automatically. If you want to start creating an image map, at this point I think it would be somewhat useless to do so, just because we're going to be modifying it so much we're going to lose a lot of that detail. But if you did want to, you just select the material you want to use at the moment. It'll apply material 1 entirely, and then you select material 2, apply 2D brushing, and then when you run an effect it will paint that distribution. But now we're just going to use this limited range and add a few more effects, sharpen that. Now if we go back to the procedural, turn off the force extension, we're going to see a rather interesting blend between these two. And now we can see a nice little edge around those areas we were just eroding. And it creates a lot of extra detail to be able to use some of the other effects. The dissolve actually needs more of a flatter region in order to work properly. But this way you can limit certain areas of the terrain. And then we can also mix it together with that zero edge. I am going to, at the moment, just reduce the resolution because it's going to be a lot quicker. And I normally end up with a resolution 4000 by 4000 just to get the most detail out of the standard terrain. But some of these effects can take a couple of minutes in order to process. So until you know exactly what it is you want, you may not want to increase that resolution all the way. But if we go back into that procedural, turn back on the force extension, we can see right now it's 2.5, what it's currently set at. When I turn it back on, it does reduce the height, kind of refreshes the value, but that extension is still applied. And now we can start to limit some of the other areas. So depending on how much we want to reduce or where we want to reduce it, we can, by slowly moving up the extension amount, work our way down the terrain, applying these effects. And every time you choose that amount, it will need to kind of process and go back. And we can increase the amount. Again, stepping our way down. And really create a neat erosion with it. Turn off the force extension, and now you can see those defined areas in a much more interesting looking terrain. That also will work with the clipping range, constrained to clipping range, that I currently have turned on for the brush modes. And that's going to be the next step. And because we have a new procedural on here, we are going to have those roughness values showing up again, or those kind of more jagged areas. But we'll be able to remove pretty much all of those once we get to the final point of the terrain. I'm going to go ahead and just kind of scale this down. It's a little too high. You can also see that it's scaling upwards towards the gizmo, or the pivot point, which means that most of the terrain procedural is being generated below zero, or at least the impact on the terrain itself. And it's really acting as more of a subtraction to the existing information. And you can usually tell just because of the offset based on the pivot point. So I'm going to do one quick variation, which is to use the zero edges with that force extension amount. So I'll go ahead and turn on zero edges, go over to the procedural and turn on force extension and reduce that number just as before. And we're going to see something a little bit different based on that zero edged amount. Because the data we generated before, already using the zero edge mode, subtracted more of the center, turning on the zero edges may not at this point round out the terrain. Also, because we are basically generating the procedural below zero, and we can really tell because the altitude production preview is black, and that range is not adaptive, at least the preview. So the zero edge mode in this case is dipping the center of the terrain and inverted. But that can be beneficial and produce some pretty neat effects. So now we can start to subtract around this area, and if we turn off zero edges, we'll be able to see something completely different. We can start to dissolve around this area. So there's really a lot we can do with it. You can add or use any of the global effects if you want to add rocks or create any sort of grit. I'm just sticking with some primary erosion effects that I like to use, which is basically the glaciation, the dissolve, and the alluvium. Of course, river valley, but that has such a large amount of subtraction and smoothing for the terrain, you do tend to lose a lot of detail. What I will do is go to the procedural, reduce the extension amount, and just turn on the zero edge and see how much of the terrain we're removing. Looks like we've got a pretty decent amount showing. I'm gonna just dissolve this area to add a little more detail, turn off zero edge, and then I'm gonna run the river valley on just these top peaks. And now we can see that effect applied. I'm gonna go to the procedural, turn off force extension, and we're going to be able to see the kind of impact that had. So now, starting on the top, we end up with this really interesting ridge because of how much of the data had to kind of span out. Also because we did a little bit of work with the zero edge mode. And whether or not it should have been kept in zero edge is really going to depend on the output you want. Also the rock hardness. But with that large of an amount, which is another reason why I tend to not use River Valley, except for a very overall look for the terrain, just because you don't get as much detail, and it does take a long time to process. We can see in this case we got that ridge. So just kind of one last thing before we start moving to the sculpting tools. I just want to take the scale and bring it down to 1. And now we're going to be able to see that mix between the current geometry and the modifying the scale. And because we have so much geometry created now, the impact of modifying the scale isn't nearly what it was before. So that way we have a lot more flexibility with the kind of fractal we can run. We can see, because of the gain output is so high, you're going to end up with a lot of jagged areas if you don't reduce the terrain height. So I'm going to bring this up to 0.7, which will give us a nice in-between, and then we can reduce from there. Go ahead and close this out. It looks like Enter did work to close the terrain editor this time, although normally it doesn't work. So for a more realistic terrain, which would be something very flat, as terrains tend to be, we should have something fairly interesting here. And I'll go ahead and just render out a preview. And at this point, because we have a lot of detail overall, I would want to increase the pixel resolution, possibly run a few fine effects, just to get some of the detail back in there and not have such a smooth terrain. Because right now it's a little too smoothed out because that resolution is just way too small. It's subtracting heavily from the procedural. So go ahead and bring that scale up to 2. Also keeping in mind that the procedural is different than the regular geometry, which right now, just by changing that, we're no longer seeing the altitude from the procedural, and it looks like it just needs to refresh. I'm going to set that scale to 1, and what I do need to do at this point is just kind of scale it back up on the z-axis. So now we'll be able to kind of move this up a little bit more, get a little more detail out of it, and I'm just going to do a preview render. But this obviously needs more work, so it's not really worth showing at this point. I'm going to go back and edit the object just to show you what it's going to look like without the function. Instead of deleting that connection this time, I'm going to just load in one of my nodes I created, which is a combiner, and just on-off switch that allows me just to keep things connected and kind of switch between different nodes. So I'm going to go ahead and just turn that off for now. And now we can just see the geometry that we've generated, which in this case ends up being a lot more interesting than being combined with the altitude reduction. So I'm going to increase the resolution, which can take a little while to process, and go to the effects, turn up that rock hardness, and start to dissolve a little. But we could also continually apply different functions, modify the terrain further. But overall, I think we've got a pretty interesting terrain generated from changing around these procedurals. And if I was sticking with the same one the whole time, it'd be a little more interesting than it has turned out. But let's take a look at some of the other steps we can do. I do want to save this out first. I'm also going to move this over to a standard terrain at this point, so now we're no longer going to have that procedural. If you do want to save or preserve the current function, you can just right click, save the function, and then load it in later. But I'm going to move this to a standard terrain, so we're just going to go up to the upper left, change it from procedural to a standard, and that's going to just take the information that's currently there and change this over to standard terrain. Gives us some more options. We're also going to have an increased response time for the larger amount of geometry. Also keeping in mind too that zero edges will no longer function like it did with the procedural. So if you do want to round off the edges or subtract, if you have the lower value as we did, you will need to go back, change it to a procedural, and then you'll be able to subtract. We do have the ability to invert a little easier now, rather than inverting just the procedural altitude. We can invert this data that we've created. We can also choose to export this either as an image or 3D format, and we can also reverse our effects. So by inverting it, we can run the effects in the other direction. If you're going to be using dissolve, it's a good idea to use the alluvium afterwards to prevent any large ridges from being created. And you can flip that back if you want, or you can stick with the other geometry. It's also a good idea to reduce and filter the output if you are not really seeing any of the effects be applied. So if we wanted to move down and lower the height, I'm just going to go ahead and save this again. What we can do to increase the impact of the effects is go to the filter altitudes and just edit the filter and drag that right side down. We'll bring it down to around 0 right now. Click OK, preview, and now I can start to see that I'm getting into the white, much brighter area just before I hit the red zone. So I can reduce this a little bit more, and we should be able to apply these effects and start to see a better output. Because I did reduce the altitude so drastically, I will need to increase the scale, the Z scale, just moving that up. Also, if you're using keyboard shortcuts for invert, which is V on the keyboard, while in the terrain editor, it will trigger the view mode. So you do have to switch that back to the global, because local coordinates tend to be very sensitive. So now we should be able to subtract from the terrain much easier. And if we need to, we can reduce that a little further, or one thing is to create a much larger subtraction or even a curve. We can also choose to equalize the terrain if needed, which also might help out applying some of these different erosions. And if you want, you can invert it, run them in the other direction to achieve a different effect. And we can switch that back. So from here, what we can do is do a little bit of sculpting. We're going to switch over to the Paint tab and choose Freeform. And I'm going to load in my No Effect filter, which is not going to apply any change, just going to trigger the 3D geometry. And now that that is applied, we've lost any sort of idea of what the terrain looks like within the editor until we increase the resolution. Because we have such a large terrain with such fine details, I already know I'm going to need a much higher resolution. Now, if we're working with a much larger area, it's typically a good idea to start with a lower resolution, work on those large areas, and then scale our way down. And what I'm going to do is just go to the first preset filter, go to Freeform, and just kind of pull up that central area. But then I am going to just subdivide the entire terrain. So I'm going to reduce the size, go to my No Effect filter, and we're going to need a value about 0.018. And you might have to do this a couple of times or reduce the scale. And I can tell that we are divided equally. So now we have much more geometry to work with for a 3D sculpt. I'm going to turn on the Show Clipping Planes, turn off Wireframe, and just move this down. And I want to work on this kind of center area that's sticking out. Reduce the flow of the brush, go back to that first filter, and increase the size, and switch to the Inflate. So now what I can do is inflate this area to fill it in a little bit better, because it was in fact a little too sharp, and I really don't want it to look like that. We can smooth it out if needed, go back to Inflate, and now work on these specific areas as needed. So you would also be able to do this process in the stage where we were at before, when we were using the procedural, and that way you can basically curve and sculpt out the displacement geometry and add a lot of extra details.